again, everyone, for joining. Really appreciate you all coming tonight. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Steve Schwartz. I run the LSAT blog. I also host the LSAT Unplugged YouTube channel and podcast. Tonight, I'm joined by Professor Barry Friedman and Professor John Goldberg, co-authors of the book Open Book, a law school prep guide. And they're here to share with us quite a bit about law school prep. Professor Friedman is also the director of the Policing Project, an organization dedicated to promoting transparency, equity, and democratic accountability and policing. So gentlemen, I thank you both for joining me tonight. How are you all doing?
Good, Steve.
Doing great. Thanks for having us.
Thanks to both of you for joining again. So I'll leave the link to your book in the chat here, and I'll post both of your bios in the chat as well, so folks can follow both of you for more, and I'll leave it to you gentlemen to take it away. There's a chat function here, folks. Feel free to ask questions in the chat at any point throughout, and I'm sure the gentleman will address them at some point.
Thanks very much. I'll start if you don't mind, Barry. I'm John Goldberg. I teach at Harvard. I used to teach at Vanderbilt, where Barry also used to teach, and that's where we met, and we've been friends for a long, long time after meeting there. So we're going to talk for a bit just to kind of set the stage, but we really want to hear from you all. So please do send in chat questions. We'll try our best to manage them. And I don't know, Steve, if you can see them as well, if there's some that you think are particularly helpful or important, please feel free to flag them. So we're going to start just about talking a little bit about this book, Open Book, which we think is very helpful to new law students. And a way to start it is by, if you will, us interviewing each other about the book. So that's the plan. So I'm going to start as the interviewer, and Barry will be the interviewee. And those are suffixes, and e, that you're going to get very used to at law school. Barry, welcome. What in the world got you thinking about writing something called Open Book, the Inside Track to Law School Success?
John, it's good to see you. You know, I for years gave a talk to students about taking exams, which I called the Pinball Theory of Exam Taking. And in fact, when I came to writing this book, I started to ask students if they'd ever played pinball, because I worried that pinball was a relic of a bygone era. Though I was gratified to learn that there was an app, so you could play pinball on an app. But I gave the talk one year to a group of students, and one of the students, who's now a professor at Kentucky, came up to see me afterward. He said, you know, you should write a book. I had just written my first book, which was very long, and I thought, well, that's an interesting idea. And I went and read a lot of the exam-taking books, because I thought, what's the point of writing a book if people have already written this book, you know, a bunch of times? And so I went and read all those books, and I thought, there's nothing quite like what I had in mind, and maybe it made sense to write a book. And that leads me to want to just say a word, if I can, about why the talk I gave was called The Pinball Theory of Exam Taking.
Sure.
So, you know, if you've ever played pinball, and if you haven't, then I would suggest that you Google it so that you get the concept. You shoot this little ball off into a playing field, and then you have these cool little bumpers, these little flippers that you can use to keep the ball in play. And what's fun is when the ball hits these bumpers, they light up and ding a lot. The score goes up and up and up. But the point was that you only score points if you hit the bumpers. So you could keep the ball in play for a long time, but not hit bumpers, and you weren't going to get any points. So the question was, what gives you points on an exam? And what was important, and as you know, obviously, because you wrote this book with me, was that the thing that gives you points is hitting on the very issues that lawyers worry about every day when they're analyzing a case, the issue and the rule and the analysis of that rule and the conclusion. And so the theory, the pinball theory of exam taking, is really a theory about how to be a lawyer. And by being a good lawyer, doing well in the exams. And so I read all the other books. A lot of those books were about gimmicks, you know, like here's a trick to doing well on an exam. And there were no tricks in my mind about this. It was just law. And so I thought, maybe that's not a bad idea.
So you see, and we see, I think both, a pretty deep connection between three things, which is legal practice, being a lawyer, classes, law school classes, and exams. I think a lot of people think that exams are just kind of this thing that happened at the end of the semester, and yeah, you got to pay attention in class to do well on the exams, but there isn't really any deep connection between classes, oral law practice, and exams. You want to say a little bit more about the connections?
Sure. You know, you might wonder why, if you wanted to write a book about how to go to law school, the book would be about exams. I mean, sure, everybody wants to do well on exams, but you know, why not write a book called How to Go to Law School? But the book, as we originally wrote it, had a lot to do with exams. And the reason for that was, on the one hand, the obvious one, which is the end point of what you do over the course of the semester is take an exam. So you want to learn how to do that. But the whole point of this book is that that end point is exactly the same end point that makes you a good lawyer. So a lot of law students, you know, complain. I'm sure you've heard the complaints. I've heard the complaints, which is, you know, you don't test us on what it means to be a good lawyer. And there are lots of things that we don't test people on that are important to being a good lawyer. Having a good personality, attracting business, talking on the telephone, Zoom. You know, there's a lot of things that don't get graded on an exam. But the essence of what an exam tests, which is your ability to reason the way that lawyers reason, is the core of what law school is trying to teach. You know, people who are watching will hear this said, you know, 100 times when they start law school, which is we're trying to teach you to think like a lawyer. Or what does it mean to think like a lawyer? And that's what the book is really about, which is try to get in the head of thinking like a lawyer and how to do that well.
Great. So one last question, which is, this was your baby and your idea, and you'd been working on this for a while, and then you called me up and said, hey, why don't you join me on this? Why in the world did you suck me into this?
Because I love you.
Oh.
You know, we were colleagues for a long time at Vanderbilt, and I thought we thought about things very similarly. You have taught, I think, every single course in the first year curriculum. Is that right? Have you?
Almost. Not quite. Almost.
What haven't you taught?
I haven't got to property yet.
Well, it's been around for a long time, so we'll be okay. It won't be going anywhere anytime
No.
soon. And I think you have a really good sense of pedagogy, of how to teach law and how to be good at being a lawyer. And it was really important to me to write this book with somebody that loved the law as much as I did, and to write a book that was about exam and law school success, but was really about loving the law and being a good lawyer. And you seemed like the best person, and I really enjoyed writing the book with you. But I have a question for you.
Right.
So we wrote the book, we traveled back and forth and spent time with each other. And then, you know, we got it done, and it seemed like right away you thought we should rewrite the book. And I wasn't sure how to feel about that, because we just done a lot of work writing the book. Tell us all what it was about the book that made you think that we should change it between the first and the second editions, and what it is, you know, that got added or was different in the second edition.
I'm a big pain in the butt, obviously, but I think the thinking, which was quite logical behind the first edition, was, look, you know, students are understandably, they don't have a lot of time, they're busy, they want to focus and figure out what's going to help them as quickly as possible, and that's in part why this is a pretty short book. But we put, in the first edition, as you'll recall, we put exams right up front. We said, let's start talking about exams, and then we'll sort of reverse engineer from exams to law school. And I think that's perfectly a good way to do it. But I think it confused students and some readers a little bit. Why are we starting at the end? I think setting it up more naturally to follow the flow of law school will invite people to pick the book up earlier, like now would be a great time. So I think a lot of students, when they see a book and say, oh, it's about law school exams, well, let's see, law school exams typically for most schools happen in December or January. So I'll pick up the book, you know, November 1st. We were getting some feedback that that was happening, and that's not the best way to use this book. This book is what is designed for you to read it, you know, pretty much now, as a preview and as a way to get sort of oriented towards law schools. And the new structure in the second edition reflects that.
Well, and we added, you know, at the front of the book, not only material about how to start going to law school, but a lot of basic information about how law works, right? Yeah. So that students could sort of fall into their seats at law school if they're going to law school live this year. We'll talk about that in just a moment. And if not, virtually fall into their seats. Having learned some basics of the American legal system, In fact, it just makes me think, and I know I'm going off scripture, so forgive me, but then you've known me a long time, so that can't surprise you. When you were at Vanderbilt, were we teaching the legal process course?
I don't think so, but I'm old and I don't remember things as well as I used to.
So, I'd been teaching there for a few years and realized that there was this big problem with law school, which was that a lot of the things that we expected students to know about American federalism and the system of American government, about the role that judges play, about what a case is exactly and how to read it, kind of fell in the cracks, what in the law we call interstices. So it was sort of assumed that by taking torts and contracts and civil procedure, you would, by some magical period of process of osmosis, take in all this other background information you needed. And we eventually started to teach a course called Legal Process, which was to teach people very explicitly about all of that. And I think we captured the flavor of some of that in this book, which is to really give people the basics of the system so that when they started law school, there was a coherent whole.
Absolutely, and it's consistent with what you were saying earlier, which is we really think, guess what? To do well in law school, you actually have to learn the law. Shocking insight.
True. I mean, we've always, everybody wants a shortcut, and I guess
Right.
you and I are not shortcut guys. So
No.
people want to shortcut this book, and we're the wrong folks. So I know we have people listening, and there are going to be more who I hope watch this after the fact. And they're undoubtedly wondering the very thing I was wondering at exactly this time in my life. Well, everybody now is wondering, when will the pandemic be behind us? But the question that's more immediately in front of them is, what should I be doing? Like, I'm going to law school. I know there are lots of courses you can take and services people want to sell you, but we have kind of a different perspective on that. So tell people what they should be doing right now if they're headed to law school in the next few weeks.
Well, congratulations, and it's going to be super exciting. And it's a lot of work, of course, but almost everyone. There's always tough parts of first year because there's a lot of pressure. But almost everyone I ever talk to thinks fondly of their first year of law school because it is this amazing experience. And so you're going to be knee deep in cases and law, and some people suggest, well, you should sort of like brush up in advance, read a mini torts treatise or a contracts treatise. I think I wouldn't do that. You're going to learn law in law school. It's not going to help you much. You're not going to get that much out of it probably to be reading substantive law. Read our book because it is designed now really to help you ease into law school and to explain to you everything from the mundane, like, hey, maybe you should check the calendar, which I didn't do when I was a first-year law student, and see, how long the semester is and when are exams going to be, and sort of start counting backwards and just make some tentative plans about how you're going to do things. So it's very mundane, but there's also, as you said, some introduction to legal vocabulary and the kind of structure of the legal system that I think will serve students in good stead in terms of orienting them. So read our book, read the newspaper or go to a news website. Law is a practical discipline. There's some great theoretical questions, including the ultimate question of what is law anyway? And Lord knows I love thinking about that question, but at the end of the day, lawyers are practical people. They're worried about things in the world. They're worried about, can I get someone to sign a waiver of liability for COVID if I'm infected in a restaurant? And will a judge enforce that waiver? Well, that's a legal question, but it's a very practical question too. And so everything you read about in the news sooner or later will matter to your legal thinking and legal studies. So pay attention to the world. And maybe have a little fun too. And you could even have some law-related fun, if yes, there are such things. Could be in the form of a movie or a TV show. There are some obviously fun, kind of goofy takes on law school. Legally Blonde is a classic, but there's a range of depictions of lawyers. Better Call Saul. You can find them. That none of them are realistic, but they wouldn't be that interesting if they were realistic. They're just kind of fun, exaggerated takes on the practice of law. There's also more serious materials. There's a great documentary called Loving on the famous constitutional case, Loving versus Virginia, which, believe it or not, in 1964, that late, recognized the constitutional right to marry a person of a different race. And it's an amazing documentary about the couple and their legal battles. So there's a range of materials, but I wouldn't get too heavy at this point. You'll be plenty busy in a few weeks.
Yeah, though I do want to underscore, because people going to law school, they're excited to go to law school and maybe a little nervous about it. You could watch that classic, The Paper Chase, to get the sense of what law school might once have been. But there's a lot of good stuff about the law. You mentioned Legally Blonde. I think one of my favorite fun movies about the law is My Cousin Vinny. But there are, as we've discussed, there's documentaries about Ruth Bader Ginsburg and her crusade for women's equality. There's the documentary 13 about sort of what's gone wrong with race and policing in the country and incarceration, and there's just a range of wonderful materials about the law, whatever interests you. Again, if you're, I'm focused very much on policing, and Michelle Alexander's wonderful book, The New Jim Crow, very troubling but important to read. So I think I echo your view that if you're hungry for law, there are plenty of places to find it in ways that don't involve trying to learn law before going to law school. What's the point of doing that? I want to ask you another question. But before I do, I just want to let folks know that I feel like one of those, television shows, like operators are standing by, but we've got the chat open. And so if people have questions, we'd like to answer questions about law school, because I think people will have that perspective that we've done this for a long time and don't necessarily have. This is going to be a weird year. I wasn't teaching actually in the spring. Were you teaching in the spring?
I did, yeah.
Yeah, I was on leave, though I took to calling it stay. I was on stay. I was in this chair a lot, both because I was quarantined, and then once the policing stuff broke out in policing, I was just 14 hours a day focusing on that. But I guest attended a couple of classes. I know a lot of schools have had the summer to sort of figure out their plans, though they're still emerging in many places. I know your school is you're going all remote, right?
Yeah, for the fall.
For the fall.
Yeah.
Well, the president said it's going to all be over by January, so that should be no problem. Yeah, of course, I thought it was going to be over by April, so I'm disappointed. And then we're hybrid, which means that particularly for the 1Ls, they're going to have some of their classes live and others online. I'm just curious about your take on what law school is going to be like this fall and how it's going to be different than it was in ordinary years, and what you'd recommend to people in terms of making the best of this, pretty rotten situation.
Yeah, it's not great. I mean, the world situation is awful, and at some level, we'll all get through this. And online learning has its pluses and minuses. But if you're in law school and you're healthy, be happy, because things are going pretty well for you. So, online, I did teach for about 6 weeks online when the pandemic hit in the spring. The good news, I think, from my perspective and others of my colleagues who taught, is you can do a lot of good teaching online, and we're getting more used to it and more experienced with it, and we're sharing documents, and we're doing polls, and we're doing chat rooms and discussion groups and breakout groups and stuff like that. So I think you'll find, by and large, whether you're online or hybrid, online only or hybrid, the classes will be pretty stimulating. In some ways, the challenges for this are going to be similar, if maybe a little more difficult than the challenges you would face in sitting in a law school classroom in regular circumstances, which is distractions. We live in a world that's just all about distractions. It's all about your phone buzzing or beeping or whatever. And none of us have the attention spans we used to. And so different professors have different rules, but when I'm teaching in residence, I have a rule of no laptops, no phones, no electronics, bring a notebook and a pencil or a pen. And that's very, medieval and archaic in some ways, but it does guarantee that people aren't as distracted. They're more locked in, and that's what you want to be. And so think about your online environment to the extent you're online. Think about where you're sitting. Think about what's around you. Think about setting things up so that you won't be distracted. It's going to be a lot harder to avoid distractions. And obviously a lot depends on your circumstances, and there are things you won't be able to control, but to the extent you can control things, try and set up things up so that you really are locked in, because law school classes, particularly in the first year, really are a special experience. And you'll miss a lot of it if you're kind of, I'm kind of listening out of my ear, but I'm also texting my friend and I'm also checking my emails or whatever. It's just not a good way. It's not, you're wasting your money, and you're not doing what you need to do to succeed in law school. So work on that, which is always harder in the online environment. But we are online, and we're not averse to being online, both in terms of how we teach, and also our book is actually partially online. And Barry, I don't know if you want to say anything about that.
Sure, I will in a minute. But it's interesting. I've never had quite, I don't know what the word is, the courage or whatever, to ban laptops in the classroom. And I do have a rule that if I wander around the room, I don't know what I'm going to do on Zoom. I guess I'm going to wander around this room. But that if I tell students, if I find you online, I'm just going to ask you to leave. And that seems really hard, like for the semester, and that seems really hardcore. But it's that same instinct you have, which is, for me, the great thing about teaching is whatever craziness is going on in the world, if I've got a case and there are people after me, and there's a problem at home, whatever it is, the door closes and I'm just there. We're all there, and it's a chance to learn. And people are paying a lot of money for that chance to learn. And it's awesome to be able to focus. I'm torn about the laptops because, people are used to taking notes by typing these days. So the studies show you do a better job of remembering if you use a pen. People have all their briefs, which I'd like to talk about a little bit with them. On the other hand, there's this constant click-clack. And I've learned that I can play little tricks in the classroom, right? If I say something like, so the 3 important things to remember about this, and all of a sudden everybody just starts typing. It's like, and the first thing is, sometimes I'll make things up just to see how far I can get people.
Can I jump in? Can I jump in right there for a moment? Which is, that's actually something we talk about in the book, and is an important point. One of the reasons I actually like the pen and paper is people can't write as much, and I think that's a good thing. Laptops invite you as a law student to be a stenographer, where you're just copying down everything you're hearing. That's not a good use of your time. You want to be listening, of course, but what you're listening for are takeaways, moments, bigger points. I always have students come up to me after class and say, you said there were 5 factors, blah, blah, blah. What were those? And I say, I don't remember. I don't even know what the 5 factors were. It's not important to have a list of the 5 factors. It's important to think about these larger questions that are bubbling up in the course of the conversation.
Well, and I always often say to people, it's right there in the case that you just read. Like, all I am doing is telling you what was in the case. So if you read the case and briefed the case, and I want to talk a bit about briefing, and we can talk about what's online. But before we get there, we got a question in the chat, which I'm sure is on a lot of people's minds. It's the thing that's on our mind. When we've had faculty meetings all summer long, and our staff, administrators and staff have just done incredible work all summer trying to get us ready for this bizarre year that we're about to have. And the issue is, how can you replicate the 1L a year for people online? And I think you're right. Zoom's pretty amazing, and I don't know that I'm going to lose a ton. I mean, I'd give anything to get back in the classroom, but I lose a ton by being on Zoom. But it is really hard for the 1Ls in particular to forge relationships, to make connections with people, to do the networking. And, I guess it's worth thinking for a minute about how, I'll just say, at NYU, I know we're trying to do a number of things, including I just got an email from the dean asking us about 1L reading groups. We had decided not to have them this year just because everybody's under a lot of pressure, but a lot of students are asking that we have them, and thinking I'm gonna teach one on what's gone wrong with policing, or what hasn't gone wrong with policing.
That'll be easy.
It would be a shorter thing to to talk about. But I think that's, you know, and I've suggested that we do that, which is we find, whether you're all virtual or whether you've got folks in the room, to try to get small groups of people together to try to build those relationships. But do you have other suggestions about how students go about networking and clubs and organizations? And
it's a great question, and Elisa, thanks for asking it. So I do hope, you know, your school should be helping you out a bit by setting up access points, and I'm sure that all the student orgs are going to be reaching out through electronic means and so on and so forth. I'm sure your classmates are going to have something which I've never used, I'm embarrassed to say, called Slack, where people, right. You know, so I think there are going to be a lot of opportunities to create communities, both large and small, and you obviously should look for them. One thing, you know, I always tell students, you know, you may feel some reluctance, maybe you don't, to reach out to professors and see, you know, whether it's office hours or another way to go, which some students have done, and my students have done in the past, is 4 or 5 of them get together and say, hey, Professor Goldberg, we're all in your torts class. Can we get lunch or a cup of coffee with you? Well, you can do a virtual version of that. So, you know, I don't know if your prof can do it or not, maybe they're too busy or whatever, but you could certainly, couldn't hurt to ask. So get a couple of friends together and say, hey, why don't we have a virtual lunch? We'll all be eating lunch on screen, but let's have a virtual lunch with 5 people and talk about what we've been talking about in torts class or whatever. So, you know, I think be creative and reach out to people and don't be shy, and you'll start making those connections.
Good. You know, I want to talk about briefly good habits for the first year. And, you know, we're hard asses, and it's probably worth acknowledging that. But, you know, I want to talk a little bit about that, because people come to law school with a certain sense of trepidation, though I think you're exactly right. I was talking with a group of students the other day, and everybody remembers it as one of the best. The first year is one of the most memorable and best years of their lives. It's intellectually just a complete, you know, fiesta of ideas that you wouldn't get in other ways and haven't experienced. And I really think people ought to dig into it. In fact, I tell people it's important to network and it's important to be in organizations, but this is different than college. And this is the one year you're going to have to really learn, and you need to learn. And when people come to me at the end of a semester and say that they're troubled by how they did, the first question I always ask them is, did they brief all the cases? Sometimes the answer is yes, and very often it's no, because briefing is work. And, you know, so everybody wants a shortcut. I just wondered if you wanted to say a word about why brief the cases, and what does it mean to brief the cases, and how do you start law school, you know, on the right foot in that regard?
Yeah. Well, I can't resist. I'll be brief. Briefing, there are different ways to do it. There's no one right way. We have suggestions for how to do it in the book, and we also have, if you buy the book, you get access to online materials, which include sample briefs, sample course outlines, and even law school exams, actual law school exams that have previously been given, along with model answers and comments by the professors who gave the exams. So there's a lot of stuff online associated with the book that doesn't show up between the covers, including these briefs. But the basic idea behind a brief, however you do it, is just to make sure you're reading super carefully and super actively. What a brief forces you to do is to repeat, sort of, if you will, out loud or on your computer screen, what you've read, and state it succinctly and clearly before you walk into class. So you read a case, and it's all right, what are the facts of the case? Well, can I actually summarize the facts of the case in less than 15 minutes or 3 pages? Can I get it down to a few lines? Okay, what legal issue is raised by the case? Well, I can give you a florid 1-paragraph description, but the goal is to get it down to a sentence or a sentence or 2, right? All of this is about reading carefully and then trying to winnow down and get to the essence of the case you've just read, whether it's the facts of the case the legal issue raised by the case, the ruling made by the court. That's what a brief does for you, and that's why it's so important, because it's that kind of care and attention and concision that are going to help you do well on exam.
You know, when you go to court, judges are going to ask about cases that are relevant, about cases that seem to preclude relief for your client, about cases that are complicated to deal with. And the best lawyers I know have this incredible facility for understanding those cases, those precedents, and being ready to talk about them. And just like, you know, we talked about writing and typing and whatnot, writing that all down, I think gives you it just kind of plants it into your brain, so that then when it comes up in class, if you're called on, or if you're not called on, you're able to just quickly get to the heart of what's going on. I want to say a word about the online materials, and then Steve's asking me to talk about policing, which I'm happy to do, always happy to do. It's what I
Yeah, you should.
That, you know, we added those online materials because students all the time complain that they're not getting enough feedback from their professors. And I tell my students, by the way, that was that little drag quote there. Whoever wrote that into the chat obviously is at least as old as I am, if they remember Dragnet. But you know, I tell my students that, you know, every professor should hand out a sample answer with after the exam, and they don't all do it. And I tell them they should feel free to tell their professors that I said that they should. Not that it's going to persuade them, but I'm all for a little shaming. And it's because, you know, you deserve to see what the exam was about. And in our book, we include not just a sample answer from the professor on those exams, but also an A, B, and maybe less than a B exam, so that people can see what, you know, those exams look like. And I think that's something you don't often get to see that's important. Hard to know what to say about policing, and certainly hard to tie it into the.
What's the aim of a lot of people are worried, of course, concerned about policing and police reform, and there's all kinds of debates, some of them very bitter about where to go from here. Everyone agrees that things have to change. There's no agreement on what should change and how. What's the contribution of the project? Why do something called the policing project? If all goes well, what do you hope is going to happen?
So we hope to bring what we call democratic policing, or front-end accountability to policing. So I've taught constitutional law and I've taught criminal procedure for years, and back in 2006, a little light bulb went off over my head, which was that when we talk about accountability in policing, we mean something different than in all the rest of government. So in policing, when we talk about accountability, which you hear about constantly now, mostly people want to either bring criminal charges against an officer who's done something, or civil rights action, or the Department of Justice go after them, or a civilian review board, body cameras. They're all forms of what we call back-end accountability, which is something's gone wrong. We want to know whose fault it was. But in most of government, that is not how we think about accountability. In most of government, accountability happens on the front end. So if you talk to a con law professor about accountability and how the system works, it's all about democratic participation, about our lawfully elected representatives making decisions to regulate things up front, administrative law also, with transparency, with public input, and once there is front-end accountability, once you have clear rules up front, it's easier to have it on the back end, because you've told police officers and police departments, policing agencies, what you want out of them. And so our goal is to bring front-end accountability to policing. If you go to our website, which is policingproject.org, there's a report up there called Changing the Law to Change Policing, in which I and a number of other folks who work on an ALI project about policing have lists of statutes that should be adopted at the federal, state, and local levels to bring front-end accountability to policing. And we also work on what we call reimagining public safety, which is this idea that you hear in the defund movement, which is that officers are asked to do way too many things, and things for which they are not trained. Police are trained mostly to use force and coercion and enforce the law, and about what the law is. And so it's not a surprise that when you call the police, you get force and law. But if there's a substance abuse problem, or a homelessness problem, or even traffic enforcement, I have a paper online at SSRN called Disaggregating the Policing Function, which sort of takes apart what the cops do all day long and asks, is the cop the best person to do this? The answer is often no. So we're holding some convenings with folks from the defund movement and trying to figure out a way forward. Because the irony is, as much as the police feel under attack right now, they agree with this proposition. They too feel that they've been forced to do too much. But I'm gonna actually say a word about how this relates to the book. Watch me do this. Here we go. We're about to start a litigation project. I always thought we would litigate, but we've just been so busy doing other things that we hadn't, but we're about to. And the goal is nothing less than to change constitutional law. Because constitutional law doesn't ask a question that I think it should around policing, which is that under the Constitution, judges are always asking, what does the Fourth Amendment say about this? Should the police have gotten a warrant? Should there be criminal charges? Did this violate, the people's constitutional rights? But what judges ought to ask is, were the police authorized to do this in the first place? Did anybody explicitly authorize the use of facial recognition, license plate readers, cell site simulators, all these surveillance technologies, certain tactics that the police use, programmatic stop and frisk? And the reason I bring that up here is because what makes a really good lawyer, I'm curious if you push back on this, but this is true of the good lawyers I know, is the ability to take the law just as they learned it, just as the cases are, and push it in a direction that they think the world needs to go or their clients' interests lead them. And that's the talent in the law. That's the thing that exam taking tests very often, which is, are you able to take the raw materials that we were teaching in class and from them construct something novel, and in a way that it doesn't look novel, because judges don't like to do anything that they haven't done 100 times before. Justice Cardozo was a genius at this, as you know. It would look like nothing had changed when everything had changed. And so that's kind of what we're trying to do with our litigation project. And that's what good lawyers do. And that is the set of skills that I think the first year is all about trying to pick up. I'm curious what you think about that.
Yeah, I think that's great. So congrats on the project. It's really important. Law, I agree completely. Some of the law you're going to learn has ancient roots, goes back hundreds and hundreds of years, maybe thousands of years. And law is very, in some ways, conservative and traditional, conservative with a small c, meaning conserving things from the past. But it's always asked to do new things. And the art, if you will, of being a lawyer is simultaneously understanding and appreciating and being fluent in the past while translating it and moving it forward in new circumstances and a new set of problems. So you're neither making things up from scratch, nor are you just doing what you've always done. It's somewhere in between, and that's the beauty of law and legal reasoning. It's all, and by the way, that's what your law school exams are going to be about. You're going to have to show that you know what's been decided and what the rules are and what the courts have said and what the legislature has said. And then you're going to be asked to apply what you know in new situations and make an argument or make a set of arguments. That's what legal reasoning is all about. That's what lawyering is all about. It's what law school is all about.
Yeah, it makes me want to invite you to say a word about Justice Cardozo and how he did this in whether it's McPherson Buick or some other case. I'd just be curious to hear you talk about how he managed to take a set of principles and push the law dramatically while making it seem like he'd done nothing other than rely on settled precedents to get there.
Well, there's a book in that, and I promise not to bore everyone with that, but Benjamin Cardozo was a famous judge in the early part of the 20th century from New York, and he was first a judge on New York's High Court, which you will learn is oddly enough called the Court of Appeals, whereas in New York, the Supreme Court is actually the trial court. I don't know why they came up with that. So he was a judge on the New York Court of Appeals for many years, where he wrote these famous decisions that you'll still read even today, 100 years later, in subjects like contracts and torts. And then he went on and was appointed to the Supreme Court. He was, trivia note, the last cross-party appointment of a Supreme Court justice in roughly 1930 was the last time that a Republican president appointed a Democratic justice or vice versa. That tells you something. But he was well known. He had this very elegant, or some people think obnoxious, writing style. And it was all about sort of saying, here's what we have, here's the way we've done things. And yet, if you kind of squint and look at what we've been doing and what we've done, you'll see within it the seeds of change. There are deeper principles lurking here in the rules, that behind the rules. And if you consult the principles, they'll actually tell you that maybe the rules aren't actually quite right, and so we need to change them. And so it's this sort of, he had this magical gift for locating or inventing, depending on who you ask, the kind of deep background and deep principles that you could appeal to move the law forward.
Yeah, and that's the trick, I think, to law school, which is being able to, the case that's on fours, it's just the same as the one you read, is the easy case, but the hard case is the figuring out how to take a new set of facts and apply those prior cases to that. So
I have a question.
Yeah, Ayaka Chin asked a question I think is a great question, which is, you know, if you've been out of school for a while, what should you do to do well? And besides saying read the book, you know, I took 1 year off before going to law school. Many of my classmates had taken no time off. And I think there's a huge advantage to taking time off, which is that if you have gone straight through, you're used to sitting in that classroom. You know, I remember just thinking, having been away a little bit, this is so amazing. It's so great to be back at school and to be learning. So I think if you've been away for a while, at any period of time, you've got a leg up in terms of the fact that you're just going to love the material. On the other hand, you're not in the habit of learning in the way that students are in the habit of learning. And I think you just have to be, you know, anything you do, whether it's briefing cases or writing outlines or whatever, it's a learned skill and it's a muscle, and you just have to get used to exercising it. And so, you know, I think being prepared at the beginning of the school year to take a little bit longer to read the cases and get them ready, and you know, might be a bit of more struggle right at the very beginning, but I think within a few weeks you'll just be tuned right back up and just like everybody else.
Yeah, let me add to that a little bit. Everything you said, I think, is right. You know, I think if you've worked for a while, you have some advantages, which is, for most of us has found that working for a living is harder than being a student, even though a student can be plenty hard. And so it might be that school in some ways feels, you know, more manageable, and that's great if it does. If not, that's fine too. Keep in mind that you're back in an academic setting, and in an academic setting, one of the things that happens is there's more sort of, if you will, flights of fancy. There's more stretching and experimenting, and what about this? And you'll hear lots of crazy ideas, and the practical working world side of you will be tempted to say, oh, come on, you know, this is ridiculous. I never saw anything like this in the working world, and nobody I've ever known has. And that might be right, but remember that the learning enterprise, the academic enterprise, is often about asking and thinking about unthinkable things and weird things and odd things, and the case where everything goes wrong, not because they happen all the time or because they are the exemplars of how the world works, but precisely because they're not. And the contrast between them and how the world ordinarily works is often super illuminating. So be patient. And remember that school is partly about divorcing yourself a little bit from reality as you try to think things through.
Yeah, you know, I want to ask if there are other questions, because if not, we will begin to wrap this up. But I'll give you an example of that comes from the policing world. So I wrote this law review article that I mentioned, disaggregating the policing function, which is coming out in the Penn Law Review this spring, because it takes forever for law review articles to come out. When I wrote it, it felt kind of futuristic. Like folks hadn't said this, and I had a bunch of ideas that seemed a little crazy. And then, you know, George Floyd was killed, and the protests began, and the world changed dramatically overnight. And things that I was writing about as futuristic, some of the jurisdictions in this country are actually trying. Our phones ringing constantly, asking us for advice on how to get from here to there. And that's the point of what you're learning in law school, which is how to be prepared for those moments, which is to say, you know, when there's an opening, when there's a chance to change the law the way that you want to represent a client's interests in the way that you think need to be represented, having the tools to foster that set of outcomes and figure out how to get there is what it's all about. It's just that kind of preparation. And then you don't always know when that moment's going to happen, but like, boom, there it is. And I always say to folks that a lot of life, you know, people say like, well, what do you do to be successful? And I often say, just be prepared, which is that you can't discount the influence of luck, of happenstance, of opportunity. It comes when it comes. But the point is that when it comes, you're ready to take advantage of it. And that seems to be critical.
Yeah.
Good. I don't see any further questions. And so I guess I'm going to turn it back to Steve to do the Steve thing. And we want to thank everybody for their time.
Thanks to both of you for holding this very informative discussion covering both the law school prep as well as, Barry, your work with the policing project. And of course, folks, please go out, get the book, Open Book. I've put the link in the chat. I will put it in the follow-up email as well. And of course, I'll include the link below this video. Again, thanks to both of you for taking the time.
Thank you very much.
Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for tuning into the show. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already to be notified of new episodes as I release them. And feel free to reach out if you need anything at all as you move forward with your prep. I'm happy to help however I can. In the meantime, I wish you all the best and take care.